Awesome. Welcome everyone today. We're just going to wait a few more minutes as people jump on. We have a very exciting panel today. Former Speaker of the House, Jeff Regan, and Liberal Cabinet Minister, and former Conservative Cabinet Minister, Tony Clement, joining us. And we have a special guest as well, so we'll leave that as a surprise for later. Monday we had our election, and I would say that it was surprises here and there, and it's probably an election that's very much based on expectations. So if you were conservative and your expectations were based in January, you're very disappointed with Monday. However, if your expectations were 3 weeks ago, or after Donald Trump's 51st, state comments, holding the Liberals to a minority and gaining a number of seats across the country, aside from Poilievre losing his own seat in Carleton, the results are probably something that you might be able to live with. And if you're the Liberals, you were looking at potentially electoral devastation and ending up in a situation that the NDP ended up with, losing party status if you were basing your expectations on January. But if you were basing your expectations on a few weeks ago, you're probably disappointed. So very interesting election. Today, we're going to break it down. We're going to take a look at what the results were and how the party's position going forward. A lot of interesting questions to answer. So for anyone that's an attendee, please post your questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to get to them as quick as possible. But let's hand it over to our panelists. So Jeff Regan, former Speaker of the House, a minister in the Chrétien government, lifelong Liberal. Tony Clement, former member of the Harris government in Ontario, as well as a cabinet minister in the Harper government. Let's get their thoughts. So, Jeff, I'll hand over to you. Congratulations on the electoral win. How are your expectations, and how are you feeling about it?
Thanks very much, Matt. Just to clarify, I was a minister in the Martin government, and not for nearly as long as Tony. So I think you summed it up very, very well. A lot changed over the past few months. If from the point of view, my point of view as a Liberal, the way things looked in November and even December, things were very bleak. And I showed in the polling graph in our previous meeting, I showed how on January the 6th, that was the very bottom, for Liberals, and things started up again the moment that Justin Trudeau announced he was resigning. And it went up from there. And it seemed, and when I showed that poll on April the 11th at our last session, I don't have it in front of me right now, but we appear, it looked like the Liberals were going to keep going upward. Well, in fact, they stopped there. And that was when they were around 44 or 45. They ended up at about 43. The Conservatives, who had dropped to, I think, the mid-30s, during the campaign were mostly around 37, 38, but they came, as you mentioned, they came on in the last couple of weeks. And I think it's interesting to discuss how that happened. And I don't know if I have the answers to that exactly, but they finished, I think, at 41% approximately, or 41.1, I think was the final number, whereas the Liberals were 43.4 or something. That gives you an idea. Now, of course, as we mentioned, I think it was you, Matt, who mentioned during that session on April the 11th, that the Liberal vote tends to be more efficiently distributed. In other words, it doesn't help you a lot if you win a bunch of seats with 80 or 90% of the vote in those seats, because that means that you're getting a big chunk of popular vote, but it's concentrated in a few seats, and you aren't winning as many seats as you'd like. And that's partly why, despite how close those numbers are in terms of popular vote percentages nationally, there you have the difference in seats that currently stands at, I think it's still 169 to 144, and so on from there. But it was a big change. Obviously, we talked before about him. Mr. Trump was a huge factor in this. The reaction to him, the concern of people about the 51st state threat, the tariffs and so forth, was a big focus of the campaign. And I think it's clear that it moved a lot of people from the NDP particularly, and to some degree the Bloc, to the Liberals. But it was interesting that there are places, when you look at southwestern Ontario, I think that we saw that some people moved from the NDP to the Conservatives, and maybe some places elsewhere also. So understanding, you think, well, wait a minute, the NDPers are left wing. How does somebody go from them to the Conservatives? But sometimes that's not the only reason they vote NDP. It's kind of they're for the little guy, perhaps. And if they see that somebody else is for the little guy, they might like that. And I think that arguably that the Poilievre camp was smart to position themselves as for the little guy over the past while. Having said that, I talked in the last session about the negatives that Pierre Poilievre had. And going forward, what's going to be interesting is does the Conservative Party and does Poilievre, who I expect will stay on as leader, and we'll probably talk about that, and I think Tony can talk more knowledgeably than I can about it. Will he take a different approach? We saw a bit of that during the campaign, right? And one argument is that the question is who should be quote unquote the attack dog or attack dogs for a party. Some would say that you want the leader to look prime ministerial, and so you let others be the attack dogs. He is very, very effective in attack. Let's face it, right? So that's a trade-off if you do that. And there's nobody else I think they have as effective in attack. At the same time, he wants you need him to look prime ministerial so that you broaden the appeal going forward. Now, so for the Liberals, this whole thing was a Hail Mary pass. And it was a Hail Mary pass that worked, even though it didn't get a majority. It looked like it would a few weeks ago, and the polls were suggesting that didn't happen. And I think it'd be interesting during this session to look a bit at particularly the places in Ontario where that didn't happen, places like Brampton West, Hamilton East, Stony Creek, and Halton Hills South. What's it called? That riding something Milton Halton Hills South.
Milton East, Halton Hills South.
Right, Kitchener, and Kitchener South Hespeler, right? Windsor Tecumseh. So there's a few seats that where there are very close margins, and it's remarkable how the next seats over will have big margins. But you see the particular seats where things turned, and it made a difference in this campaign. It prevented the Liberals from getting a majority, and it added to the seats for the Conservatives.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Jeff. Tony, how are your expectations and how are you feeling after that? Are you relieved or are you disappointed? Like, where do you sit?
Well, listen, the whole point is to win the election. Anyone who's telling you that it's wonderful, what a great victory, when there in fact is no victory, is deluding themselves. So let's get that out of the way at first. So no, I'm disappointed, and I'm not disappointed because I felt that being 26 points ahead was realistic several months ago. But no, I think after 10 years of Liberal rule, there's usually a cyclical change, but it didn't happen to do that. It didn't happen this time, and it's a very rare case that you get a fourth term. That's almost unprecedented. So none of that is good. There are, incidentally, I campaigned in 15 ridings, 2 of them in Northern Ontario, 3 in Toronto, and the rest in the 905 region. So I had a pretty good sense of what was going on out there, at least in my mind I did. And I think there are some positives. There are some silver linings in the face of an electoral defeat, which is to say the strength of Pierre Poilievre and the Conservative Party in certain demographic groups like 18 to 30, 30 to 50, young people and millennials, blue collar workers, and certain ethnocultural groups, particularly Hindu and Chinese. We did very well in both of those communities. And that made a difference in certain ridings, certainly in Newmarket, Aurora, and in Milton, as Jeff mentioned, and a bunch of other ridings. It made a real difference. And we came close in some ridings, like in Brampton and Mississaugas, because of that. So there are some things that can be built on. We had a record number of union endorsements, police unions, private sector building trades unions like LiUNA and the IBEW, the Electrical Workers Union. This hasn't happened for any conservative leader federally. We had 1.1 million more voters vote for Pierre Poilievre than voted for Doug Ford 2 months earlier. I just wanted to state that for the record. Apropos of nothing, I'm sure. I don't know why I even mentioned that.
Why is that relevant at all? Yeah.
Why is that relevant? I don't know. And of course, Pierre, because of the polarization, received the highest number of votes of any conservative leader ever. Not enough to win, though. Those are all wonderful statistics, but we're still in second place. So it's going to be interesting to see how Prime Minister Carney deals with the immediate crises that are on his lap, and only on his lap. The Trump tariffs and the relationship with the United States. I think there's a recession coming, imminent recession, and the invariable national unity crisis with the election of a Parti Québécois government soon enough, plus Alberta and Saskatchewan. So yeah, he's got a lot on his plate. I wish him well, but we're in the cheap seats now in the opposition, so we'll be watching rather than doing.
Yeah, thank you for that, Tony. Jeff, do you have a point on that?
Matt, there's an article in today's Globe that, among other things, says the Canadians woke up to find that 60 ridings had changed hands, with most of those flips taking place in Ontario. The province saw 23 ridings dump their incumbent parties, followed by 13 flips in BC, 13 in Quebec, 8 in the Prairies, and 3 in Atlantic Canada. Interestingly, the Conservatives gained 30 seats, 18 from the Liberals, 10 from the NDP, and a few from the Bloc and Green, 1 from the Green, I guess. The Liberals gained 29, 11 from the Conservatives, 7 from the NDP, and 11 from the Bloc. So that, and 1 went from the Liberals to the Bloc. It's kind of a strange mishmash across the country a bit. Like, for instance, in my province, the Liberals gained 3 seats from the Conservatives, which is more than I would have expected, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so no, that one hurt. Rick Perkins losing hurt for sure. And
Steve Ellis
as well. Yeah,
but the thing is, but this is a province where the NDP vote, province. I mean, the NDP was a provincial government here a decade ago, and so there is some provincial strength across the country. One of the interesting questions that people are discussing in the media is this the end of the NDP nationally? Right? Mm-hmm. I doubt it. And I think that, an awful lot of this has to do with the issue. We had the issue of the day. People voted, a lot of them, with that in mind, with Trump in mind. This was without question. I mean, look at what they did for Doug Ford and the not for Canada not for sale stuff, the hat that Doug wore, right? That stuff, people were very seized with that over the past couple of months, and that had a big impact on voting. What will be the issue in the next federal election? Who knows? And sometimes the issue can change. I remember the 97 election, and it wasn't the beginning of the election, it wasn't healthcare, it wasn't the issue, but by the end, it definitely was. So,
I think you're right, Jeff. Those who voted Liberal, that was their number one issue, Trump tariffs, 51st state. It wasn't, and this was the frustration for the Pierre Poilievre campaign, that they had to do enough of a pivot to address that issue. But if they completely abandoned what the other half of the electorate thought was the number one issue, cost of living, crime, immigration, those issues, then they would have lost the entirety of their base. So he really was in an impossible situation. You couldn't do both at the same time very well. That's an obvious question, obvious thing to say. So yeah, I mean, we don't know what the issues are going to be next time, but I think you asked, Matthew, whether about Poilievre. I think he's going to stay. It's embarrassing and frustrating that he lost his riding. There's no question about that. Nobody likes the leader losing their riding unless they're on the way out, I guess. But at the same time, he has, he galvanized a lot of people who believe that he is the answer to our problems, and they're not going away anywhere. They're part of our
Mhm.
Conservative Party. They're loud and proud, I guess. And does he have to change his tone a little bit? Maybe. But at the same time, people feel passionately that we've got to change direction in this country. So that wasn't enough to win with the overriding Trump factor, but it's still part of our politics here in Canada for sure.
And it's going to
Yeah.
be interesting going forward, just the choices that each of these parties, all of them have to make. You know, the Liberals, I mean, my sense is that Mr. Carney wants to take the party and the government back toward the center, more toward the center than it has been. Um, and when you do that, you have the danger of enlivening the left wing, you know, enlivening, helping the NDP, and you lose supporters to them. So, and can you gain enough in the middle? It's it's not easy to do that. And from the opposite side, there's the question of whether Poilievre has to maintain his base also, but appeal broadly, and it's always a challenge.
Hmm. Yeah. There was a lot we kind of touched base there. But one issue let's dive into is the NDP. So they lost party status. It was the worst election in their entire history, even when they were called the CCF. And they kind of repeated a very predictable situation where a minor party in a coalition is punished and ultimately destroyed, where the government is able to claim credit for all the successes, and the minor party wears a lot of those failures. We saw that in the UK with the Liberal Dems, who were supporting the Conservatives in 2010 to 2015, and they were devastated in the subsequent election. We saw it in BC, where the Greens were propping up the NDP, and the NDP was able to call a snap election and be returned with a majority. So it seems to be quite common. But how does the NDP like get out of this? One thing that Richard Canning said when he was on our previous panel was that he did not want to elect a Pierre Poilievre government. How do they rebuild from
Yeah.
here? And should they support the Liberals? Should they cooperate with them, or are they going to behave differently and strike out independently and try to do a vote by vote basis minority rather than some kind of agreement? So maybe Tony first.
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's ridiculous that NDP are willing to put their animosity towards Pierre Poilievre ahead of winning seats. Your whole purpose as a political party, I'm sorry, I'm being blunt here, you have no other purpose. You have one job, which is to win seats. And so for them to say, well, we didn't want to win seats and have Pierre Poilievre well, if Pierre Poilievre was a prime minister and you have more seats, believe me, the next election you can run on the anti-Poilievre platform and do it very well. Thank you very much. But no, they wanted to keep the Liberals in power. I just think it was incredibly stupid tactically and strategically, and they paid the price. So if any NDP leadership candidate thinks that the way to heaven or redemption is to constantly run against the opposition party rather than the government, they don't have two brain cells to rub together. I'm sorry, that's just ridiculous, in my humble opinion.
Yeah. Jeff, what do you think about that?
I think that there will be some NDPers, I don't know what percentage across the country, who will say what Tony just said, essentially, right? What the heck were you doing? Arguably, they could have won, they could have increased their seat count had they defeated the government back in November. They would have ended up with more seats. Now, the other side of that argument, other NDPers would argue, look, our objective is to achieve things in terms of policy, right? And that's the opposite of what the policies we get from Pierre Poilievre are the opposite of the ones we're trying to achieve. So that's why they would be against. That's why they would put that ahead of gaining seats. So they'll have that debate internally, and it could be divisive, but there'll be issues in all parties that are divisive, of course, as there always are. I think that Mr. Singh said he did that for Canada. Well, okay, but it also wasn't great timing for an election. I mean, yes, they would have gained some seats, but they certainly weren't going to make great, it was clear last fall that most of the benefit of an election then was not going to fall to the NDP. It was going to go to the Conservatives, right? And the same,
fair enough,
right?
Yeah.
A lot of the Liberal decline interestingly, wasn't to the NDP, it was to the Conservatives, whereas the NDP decline did come to the Liberals.
Yeah, in most areas, although it was mentioned Southwestern Ontario, London and Windsor
Sure.
and Hamilton, I
Kitchener.
believe that we picked up a lot of NDP votes. I campaigned in Sudbury East, Manitoulin Nickel Belt, where we displaced a Liberal incumbent with a great guy, Jim Belanger, and there were a lot of orange votes that went blue. So
Yeah.
again,
No, I did mention
Timmins is another example.
No, that's my mistake because I did say that earlier, and I think that's one of the very interesting things about this campaign is how the Conservative Party over the past couple of years has managed to appeal to certain groups. The fact that you had, as Tony mentioned, LiUNA, right? Some and other significant unions that supported the Conservatives. That's unheard of. What the heck is going on, right? So that's a fascinating development, and we'll see whether that carries on in the future or how that develops.
Yeah. Well, let's dive into that.
I do think I do think that there is still there's a strong group of Canadians, there's a large group of Canadians, not a majority by any means, that, whether it's 15-20%, who lean strongly left. And they'll say, well, I loaned my vote to the Liberals, but only because of this issue. So that's why I see the NDP certainly had the opportunity to come back to bigger numbers. But on the other hand, there are broad swaths of the country who will never vote. A lot of people who will never vote NDP. And so it's hard for me to imagine the NDP ever becoming government unless they change who they are over time.
Well, let's dive into it. So we talked a little bit about kind of that realignment, and just to recap what we're talking about, we saw big swings in like working class towns in Southern Ontario from the NDP to the Conservatives. We saw a little bit of a change in terms of based on demographics in the 905 and 416, where the Conservatives made gains in the younger ridings like Peel and Vaughan, like huge gains in Vaughan, where close elections in like Vaughan Woodbridge were blowouts this time, and safer or Liberal seats that are normally kind of competitive, like Davenport, ended up being massive blowouts for the Liberals over the NDP. We saw working class and rural areas of British Columbia, Vancouver Island, the North, the Conservatives makes gains there, but the Liberals kind of cleaned up the Lower Mainland. So looking at all that, and we're in a situation where we had a very polarized electorate where it was just a two-party debate, which is pretty rare. So my question for you guys is, every once in a while we have elections that redraw the political map, and we live in that new reality for a state of time. So 2015 looked like one of those kind of redrawings where 2019 and 2021 looked largely the same as 2015, give or take a little bit here and there. 1993 was another massive redrawing of the political map with the PC party dying and reform coming about. Is this election a kind of new normal that we have, like with all these things we talked about with demographics and unions and things like that? Or is it more of a one-off? Like, do you see that things kind of return to more conventional normal? So I don't know who wants to answer that first, but I think that'd be a good thing to discuss.
I guess I'm a little worried about this, I suppose, but arguably, I mean, the fact that the Conservative Party achieved a higher percentage than it's achieved in a long time at 41 point whatever percent, right? That was a remarkable thing. Will that hold in the future in the same way? For the Liberals, it may be tougher because there's no question that this was something that is not likely to reappear. The particular threat of Donald Trump and tariffs and 51st state stuff, right? It's not likely to be the issue or the situation in the next election. So how do they broaden their appeal? And mind you, if they back away if they decide, okay, we don't like some of the things that Justin Trudeau said did rather, we're not going to continue with those. We're going to take other approaches on some things. Maybe that will broaden their appeal and eat into some of that Conservative vote. But that's going to be very interesting to watch and a real challenge for the Liberal government.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I see Mark Carney as more of an interim figure rather than a game changer in our politics. I don't think he'll be around forever, obviously, and I think that kind of some of the trends that we're seeing in this election are going to overpower him over time, as we've just been talking about. I also think that within the Liberal Party, there are divisive issues that have been papered over with success at the ballot box for now, but they're going to have to make choices. They've got a faction in the Liberal Party that believes in net zero and believes the environment above all else. And then you've got Mark Carney's own words about wanting to see more growth, and maybe taking a different position on pipelines and so on. But if he doesn't improve on those kind of infrastructure issues, pipelines and mines and whatnot, again, this will have an impact on national unity, because there's definitely in Alberta and Saskatchewan, they're watching very closely, and if they see a reversion to traditional Liberal policies, that only spurs separatist talk. So, and then of course, if you move on those issues, that could hurt them in Quebec. So really, because I think their stranglehold is very tenuous on some of these Bloc Québécois ridings that could disappear very quickly if he moves on those issues. If he doesn't move on those issues, then he's got problems in Western Canada. So again, those are his problems. They're not my problems, but I'm going to be watching very closely.
I would put it slightly differently. I don't think that he's going, I think a prime minister should be concerned about the whole country, and every minister should take responsibility for the whole country. And I'm sure Tony would agree. Having said that, when you're talking about your political strategy, the Liberals are not going to look for a lot of seats in Alberta and Saskatchewan anytime soon, right? But they do, however, need to show that they have an economic strategy now, okay, that they're concerned about the economy, right? That they want to take action and have a strong economy and implement measures that will strengthen the economy and increase productivity in Canada. That's going to be interesting and challenging to see how they manage that and yet keep the folks that Tony just talked about on side. But some of them came. I mean, it's interesting how they came on side even during the leadership race. Like, I was astonished at some of them who came on Carney's team after Carney said, I'm going to get rid of the carbon tax." Right. So some folks said, okay, I guess the people have rejected that and we have to move on. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah. Well, I'm just going to remind everybody we have a Q&A feature. So post your Q&As, your questions into the question and answer box, and we'll do our best to get to them. But let's talk about pivoting for how the parties move forward. So first question here from Kayla. Do you think the election results have signaled that Pierre's personality and approach doesn't resonate with many Canadians? If so, do you think he will/can pivot? And what would be your advice to him? So we'll open up there. Maybe I'll go, Tony, for you first, and then we'll go over to Jeff.
Yeah, I kind of like the Pierre. First of all, I know Pierre personally for decades, so the harshness of what was being portrayed about him isn't the reality, but that's politics. So I personally liked the last couple of weeks of this campaign, where I think more shades of personality and approach that are softer sort of came out a little bit. He got more emotional, and he talked about things not in a sharp way, and I kind of like that. So I would like to see more of that. It's always tough in opposition because you've got to oppose, right? So people might get upset with you for opposing, but that's also the job. But I thought his approach, I thought he matured during this campaign and was better at the end of the campaign than he was at the beginning of the campaign. And so all of these things, I think, bode well for a more well-rounded prime minister in waiting than we had at the beginning. I mean, and don't forget, this was his first national campaign. I mean, it's not easy to run for prime minister, right, Jeff? It's not an easy job.
Not at all. Not at all. And
yeah, go ahead, please.
I didn't want to interrupt. I think that that there are lasting lessons, or lessons that imprint themselves on you when you're in the middle of that process, right? And I would not be shocked to see Poilievre continue to take an approach that's more like that and let others in his party do the, still be very hard on the government. And he'll be hard on the government, but not with perhaps the same, forgive me for saying so, the same nastiness, right? I mean, he can still be tough. And that's a real fine line to walk. But I think that he succeeded in the last couple of weeks in changing, in presenting a different part of his personality, as Tony said. He has to do that. He did over the past year or so, a couple of years maybe since he became leader. His image kind of changed. I mean, he used to be this skinny guy with glasses from 15 years ago in the back when he was PS and following the Calandra after Calandra had the job of answering all the questions and being always attacking the NDP back when they were the official opposition. But he changed, to see him wearing T-shirts, to bulking up, looking more like the everyman and appealing to the everyman, so to speak, and every person. That was interesting. Obviously, it helped in that appeal to the people like the union members and so forth that they were going after it. So, but he has to continue, I think, in that. He also has to make wise choices. And I think if you look at one of the reasons he lost in his own riding, among the reasons were, his support of the truckers. I mean, he's in Ottawa area riding where people did not like what was happening with the truckers blockade, okay? And yet he was seen as supporting them. So he's going to have to make wise choices going forward on issues like that allow him to hold his base, right? And still appeal to the base in kind of the way that Donald Trump does, and yet broaden his tent.
So I got another question here that two questions actually I think that I'm going to combine here. So the first one is from Tanya. So given the outcome of the election, how do you foresee the shift in federal leadership impacting provincial and federal collaboration? So we saw very frosty relations between the federal government, especially with the province of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and at times with Ontario, and at times good relationships with Ontario. And then the next question from Catherine that I think I can kind of combine into this is thoughts on who Prime Minister Carney might select for key cabinet positions and how that's going to impact sentiment and those relationships. So with the fertilizer industry largely based on the production side in Saskatchewan and Alberta, maybe some names let's talk a little bit about the interprovincial relationships and who you see in cabinet. So Tony, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, just on the federal provincial relations, I think Mark Carney does have an idea and an agenda, mostly surrounding intra-provincial trade, and wants to get that done quickly, strike while the iron is hot. And so if he can make progress on that, and he can only make progress on that with collaboration with the premiers. So yeah, I think that there could be some really interesting shifts. We already have the bill in Ontario and the law in Nova Scotia to make it easier to collaborate on reducing intra-provincial barriers, and so that can become a template that is throughout the Dominion. And so yes, I do see that as a positive for sure. Key cabinet positions, I'm going to defer to my Liberal friend on that. I don't really have a sense of what's going on there. I've got to be honest.
I must admit I didn't prepare for that question. I wasn't looking over the current cabinet list, but we saw that the Liberals lost one minister in Kamal Kara. Any other ministers? I can't think of any other offhand. I don't think so.
Well, was Le Boutillier, was she still a minister?
Well, she wasn't a minister under Carney, right? But I mean, I thought I was saying that this morning, in fact, that someone pointed out, no, she's not a minister. She wasn't a minister under the shuffle that Carney made. Okay. Would she have gone back in? I don't know. Now, one of the places that's going to be interesting in this regard is in Nova Scotia. And by the way, I'm going to go back first to the question about collaboration. So I think it's going to be interesting because we are seeing Danielle Smith take a fairly strong, aggressive stance toward the federal government and Carney and so forth, and as saying you've got to have energy development and you've got to be supporting energy development if you want to hold Canada united. So that's an interesting approach, and she will be challenging to deal with. on the other side, you had Doug Ford, who has some friction with his federal counterparts, and so far appears to get along very well with Mr. Carney and company, as does Premier Houston in Nova Scotia. Now, Tim Houston, for a while, even when he first was elected premier, was taking an approach that, no, we're the progressive conservatives. We're nothing to do with those guys. And that worked for him. Is that what this is about? But on the other hand, or is it because, I mean, arguably, if you're a provincial premier, you don't want the party in Ottawa to be the same stripe, because then you can't blame them for everything. And premier, I mean, I've seen a lot of provinces over the years when they got political problems, suddenly the problem, according to them, is Ottawa. And that's a very effective strategy, whether you're in Quebec or in Nova Scotia or where have you.
Mm-hmm. So Jeff, I'm gonna put a gun to your head.
Post. Sorry, I mentioned
on cabinet.
Okay, but cabinet. All right. So,
Yeah.
well, that's a tough one because, I mean, I'd look at who we just went in. Well, Bob Fife, in an article on the Globe recently, yesterday, I think, suggested that they'll increase the numbers from 24 to maybe 30, so that it won't be quite as small as the first cabinet. He argued, according to his sources, whether they're right or not, it will still be a gender balanced cabinet. We'll have to see if that's the case, right? I do have, I think, a little more insight here in Nova Scotia than I do elsewhere. We have a situation here where Sean Fraser, who was the minister, announced he wasn't going to reoffer. And then after that, in fact, he announced that the night before Chrystia Freeland sent her letter, her famous letter in December, talking about the costly political gimmicks, right? The one that kind of put the knife into the prime minister and caused him a couple of weeks later to say, I'm out of here. So, but Sean then decided later he would reoffer. And in my view, he is the most effective performer the Liberals have in question period and in the House. So it's hard not to have him in cabinet, I think. Yeah, but before the election, and before he announced that, in fact, the new prime minister appointed Cody Blois from King's Hants as the Minister of Agriculture. Will he remain the Minister of Agriculture, which I think is important to Fertilizer Canada? I would think, I mean, am I right in thinking that the two most important ones, or the three departments for Fertilizer Canada, would be agriculture, environment, maybe trade?
Yeah, I would also throw transport in there, and then of course the portfolios that affect everything with finance, but definitely agriculture. I think a lot in the industry are like looking at that specific question that you had, is there two ministers from Nova Scotia? And obviously we saw a lot of like high profile candidates that Mark Carney was able to recruit. You're seeing like the former mayor of Vancouver, Gregor Roberts,
Evan Solomon.
Evan Solomon. So maybe actually just explaining to the audience the regional considerations that prime ministers have to have. It's not just, necessarily like gender balance and competency. It's also regional dynamics. But maybe if you can speak to that, Jeff, for a second.
No, I'll get to that. But not only that, right? But, as we've seen in the last couple of decades, the people in the PMO, including the prime minister, are thinking about what's the picture going to look like behind the prime minister in the House when the cameras are on during question period. And they want diversity, they want youth, and they want women, right? Well, that's diversity, that's part of the diversity, but they want all those things in the picture behind the prime minister. And those, the first two rows are the cabinet, or maybe the first two and a half right close around him, right? So he does, they'll have that in mind. It was interesting to me in the shuffle right after he became leader and became prime minister that there was no minister from Prince Edward Island. I'd be a little surprised if that doesn't change because, they won all 4 seats. It might have been seen as a slight, remarkable. I mean, that they still won all 4 seats in Prince Edward Island. But again, a lot of that would have been the collapse of the NDP and Green vote. And so I expect to see a minister from Prince Edward Island. It wouldn't be a shock to have a minister of agriculture from Prince Edward Island, possibly, because that's a big part of their economy. But the fact of the matter is, when you're prime minister, you have to think about, okay, we need somebody from the north, from one of the from one of the Northern Territories. We need a bunch of ministers, a handful of ministers from British Columbia. We need a bunch from Ontario, a bunch from Quebec. We got to think about who can answer questions in both languages, who can be effective in both languages on television, not only in question period, but also in the scrums afterwards or on the various programs like Power and Politics that cover politics, right? But the regional balance is a huge part of it. Having a certain number of ministers from each region of the country so that there are voices at the table from that region, which of course is obviously harder when it comes to the prairies. Now, the Liberals gained a seat in northern Manitoba, interestingly, and they have a couple in the Winnipeg area. And they have, I guess, I was thinking they gained one actually in Saskatchewan. They have one seat in northern Saskatchewan, right? And I can't remember who that is, but I'd be very surprised if that person isn't the minister in a week or so.
Yeah.
Can I say a couple things here too? Arguably, Justin Trudeau was the least serious prime minister Canada has ever had. And Mark Carney could decide that he wants a different kind of ministry, be more serious, with more emphasis in his cabinet picks on competency rather than gender, regional, and DEI kind of issues. So it'll be interesting. I don't know the answer to that, but I think part of his personality is that he wants to be the most serious guy in the room. And so some of the things that dominated cabinet picks over the last 10 years may not dominate this time.
Maybe because I'm in Nova Scotia, I see the regional thing as something that's pretty much inescapable. And I don't know if Tony would agree coming from Muskoka.
Yeah. Yeah, Tony being in Ontario, I'm from Ontario as well. Ontario is the center of the universe, so the regional considerations in Atlantic Canada are definitely something that exists.
Well, but we had Peter MacKay, so he was like three ministers.
Yeah, the minister for Newfoundland. So as well,
if you didn't have a minister from Manitoba, it would be a problem, right?
For sure. I mean, there has to be a bare minimum, absolutely, but. I was thinking less of the regional considerations and some of the other overlays that Justin Trudeau had.
Yeah. Well, let's jump into a policy issue here. So Michael Dalton has a transport-related issue. So in the last couple of years, one of the biggest issues for Fertilizer Canada has been our inability to move our product. So we've seen multiple major port strikes. This past summer, we saw a double rail shutdown. And it felt like we were kind of in an awkward position where the Liberal government was hearing our concerns and telling us how important our product moving was to them, but they were held a little bit hostage by the NDP in the last parliament, and they were very hesitant to do anything to crack down on a strike or a lockdown. So Michael Dalton asks, how do you see this government and this parliament responding to job actions that have crippled Canada's railway and ports over the last several years? Liberals were very hesitant to get involved as deliberately as the Harper government used to. What do you see going forward? Do you think this is going to be a continuation of the same situation in the last parliament, or are we into a new kind of era?
No, I think that we are in the latter. We're in a new era. The NDP are not going to be relevant, and they're just not going to be relevant for at least a year and a half, possibly 2 years. So I think, and I think it's very clear in Mark Carney's world, and I think this is the realistic world, that Canada has got to move again, and we've got to build again, and we've got to do the things that a normal G7 economy should be doing, but hadn't been doing for 10 years. So no, I think that those shutdowns and strikes are, if they have an impact on, if they're having an impact on the economy, I think the government will move very quickly. Jeff, what do you think?
From 2006 to 2011, Stephen Harper governed with minority parliaments, almost as if he had a majority, and he did it very effectively, putting opposition parties, particularly the Liberals, in difficult spots, right? But that was very effective. So, a prime minister, it is possible for a prime minister to do that, despite the fact that she or he hasn't got a majority. And I think that Tony's right that the NDP have the problem that they now have to pick a leader, right? Well, you don't cause an election when you're in the middle of a leadership race, which is going to take a while. And they'll probably say we have to they may say we need to take time to do this right and figure out where we're going for a party. Who knows what they'll do, but they're not going to do it in 6 months, in my opinion. Right? It will be a while, a year and a half or two perhaps, before they are ready to say, okay, we want to defeat the government. The other thing is, I don't think they have any money. They didn't have much money going into this race. They'll have even less now, if any, and they will need money to cause an election. So those 7 MPs, it'll be interesting to watch, but I think that they'll be forced to hold their vote, to hold their noses, and allow the government to stay in place. Right? And to do that, they may actually have to vote in favor of the government, because as long as you have the Conservatives and Bloc voting against the government, that puts, and in fact, partly what they'll do is put the NDP in that spot. Though, and it was interesting that Jack Layton, when we were the third party from 2011 2015, and not just Layton but Mulcair, but both of them managed very effectively to put the Liberals in a position by saying we're gonna oppose the government regardless, and then the Liberals had to decide, okay, do we cause an election, right? And actually going in 2011, that allowed Jack Layton to say to Michael Ignatieff, because it started before that, to say to him, well, you didn't show up for work, which in my view was nonsense. But the point is that because we were abstaining from some votes, so there wouldn't be an election, which people didn't want to pay for. It was so expensive, right? That it was, you were put in an impossible spot. The NDP now may be in that spot for a while. But on the other hand, after they have a new leader, that new leader may be very concerned about not following the lead of Singh, and the idea of him signing him having a supply and confidence agreement to continue the government for a certain period. I can't see them wanting to do that.
So jumping in on that, how long do you think this minority is going to last? Because based on historical precedent, they don't last very long, and we just saw one that almost went the full term. So when do you think we're in an election again?
Couple of years, Tony?
Yeah, I mean, there is some speculation that Carney can last close to the term again because of the strong minority position that he has, not a weak minority. Let's be honest. But no, I think that assuming that Pierre Poilievre stays in as leader, and assuming that the NDP pick a leader in the next 18 months, let's say, to 20 months, then, and assuming that the Trump crisis, maybe after the US midterms, becomes less of a crisis, that maybe the political situation will be such that we could be prone to another election.
Joanne here asks, what are your thoughts on the likelihood that 3 MPs will risk crossing the floor for the purpose of Liberals forming a majority government? So that one, let's talk about the likelihood of that. And then 2, should Mark Carney do that? I know that it backfired with Paul Martin bringing in so many different, from both the left and the right, and it kind of broke up his coalition. So if you were Mark Carney, would you be trying to make some phone calls right now? And what do you think the odds are that could happen?
So I don't think that was what caused problems for Paul Martin personally. I mean, it had a lot to do with sponsorship and a lot to do with the uniting of the right. I mean, in 2004, a lot of MPs in places like, rural Ontario, Liberal MPs lost their seats when the right reunited. Okay, but sponsorship had a lot to do with it, especially in Quebec. A lot of support lost through that. I think that someone like Scott Bryson crossing the floor, I don't think that caused a big problem for the Liberal Party. I'm trying to think of who else did it. Of course, Belinda crossing the floor. I don't think that did that either so much.
That was actually a relief.
But it doesn't mean it'll happen now. However, there will be. I mean, I'm sure that there are probably some MPs. I don't know, maybe in NDP who are asking themselves, what's the best approach for me at this point? But maybe not. I don't know. The other thing is that it's hard to imagine Bloc members crossing, but who knows? Then there is the question of by-elections, because as there are always things that happen, right? And people whether somebody dies or someone decides to run for a mayor or enter premature politics or whatever, and they leave and there's a by-election. Every year or thereabouts there are by-elections, and the numbers can change. And what direction will they go? Will the Liberals be able to get to 172, or would they possibly decline to 165? Who knows?
Yeah, if I were advising Mark Carney, which I'm not, in case anybody's wondering,
Let me record this though, okay?
I would advise against doing this floor crosser thing. I think it looks cheap and backroomy, and he doesn't. Quite frankly, he doesn't need to. He's in a strong position. They're not going to be nipping at his heels for a couple of years, probably. So why do that and tie yourself into pretzels? And I look at the NDP caucus. I haven't memorized the seven, but Davies and Boulay-Reisse are two that I know pretty well. They are not going to cross the floor to the Liberal Party of Canada. Just, I don't know the other five, but there's two right there. Yeah, you just can't see it.
No. I mean, let's say Peter Julian had been reelected, right?
Yeah.
Unimaginable.
Unimaginable, right? Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, I think their caucus right now is Jenny Kwan, Don Davies. I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name right, but in Winnipeg, Gadsden, Heather McPherson. They had no seats in Ontario, which I think is tremendously interesting, and then Boulay-Reisse as well. So, and then Gord Johns. So it'd be a tough group to crack to move over.
Life's full of surprises, but those would be big surprises. And mind you, like when some of the people who've crossed in the past have shocked me. So you never know.
Yeah, you never know. But that's my projection, and my point stands that he doesn't really need to do that anyway.
Yeah. Well, we're getting close to the end here. We've got about 7 minutes left. So if anyone has any final questions they want to put in the Q&A, please do so now. But let's look ahead. We were expecting a speech from the throne. Bob Fife has been speculating on some internal sources about a quick legislative agenda, the House coming back for a spring session. What do you expect? And what do you think the Liberals are going to prioritize in those early days? What should we expect in a speech from the throne? First bills back, things like that, and anything that our industry should be expecting or aware of?
Well, I think it's at the moment it's all about tariffs. To some degree, 51st state, but primarily it's about how we respond economically to tariffs. So I do anticipate. I mean, I'm going to be interested in seeing the speech from the throne and the budget, right? And I would expect in both of those to see signals from the government that it's moving to strengthen our economy, to improve our trade opportunities around the world, other than with everybody else, right? And also, at the same time, it's going to be focusing on communicating strongly with Washington.
Yeah, I tend to agree. As I think Premier Ford said, it's the tariffs, stupid. So I think that, and just Mark Carney has been pretty clear on how he sees this to be a new phase of our history, that America is decoupling from the liberal international order, including the economic order, and that we're going to have to fend for ourselves a lot more. So I expect to see that in policies that relate to critical minerals, that relate to manufacturing, that relate to new trade orientations, all of these things. So that's what I'm expecting on the speech from the throne.
And you would think on transport, that would be an element
of the
effort to make sure that we can be competitive internationally.
Exactly.
Right? And personally, I'll be interested to look in the budget. Are there signals to small business who some people in small business, have viewed the government and the Liberal government in the last few years as the enemy, right? As unfriendly. Okay. And so I'll be interested to see if there are signals in the budget that say, no, we're going to be friendly to you now.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I've got one more question here. So this might be the last one that we're able to get to. We talked a little bit about on the demographics, but Colin is wondering, do you think the Liberal dominance with senior voters will be a long-term trend for elections to come? And maybe we'll throw on the other end of that question, the Conservative dominance amongst youth. What are your guys' thoughts on that?
Well, in the long term, we're all dead,
True.
including seniors. That's probably harsh, but I look.
That'll be
I
the quote
think
from today.
That's as good an
I
answer as
know
any.
Yeah,
is yeah. This is Chatham House rules, I'm sure.
definitely.
But no. In all seriousness, I felt I may be an outlier, but I felt we were losing seniors' votes with Justin Trudeau. That I remember door knocking in 2015 in my riding, and a senior would answer the door and they'd say, "Well, Justin Trudeau's a nice young man. Why would I vote against Justin Trudeau?" So I don't see this as a big trend for this election, but I could be wrong. But that's my own personal lived experience. So I think that. To the extent that this election was about fear rather than hope for the future, that's in the minds of boomer seniors. That's what carried the day for the Liberal Party. And I don't see the Conservative Party turning away from youthful voters. So that would be stupid. I mean, they're going to be voting for a long time, so you want their votes for multiple elections. So yeah, I see this trend as continuing. I don't think anything's going to break it up.
I think young people are more likely to vote for a change. And that would apply, if the Conservatives become the government, right? Or if it's the Liberals, whoever's in government, that the young people tend to think, well, if I have a change, maybe things will open up and I'll have more opportunity if there's a change, right? Or I don't like A, B, and C, and I want some change. That's tip, and there's less risk when you're 20 years old. If you don't see a big risk because you haven't got a lot, you haven't got a house, you haven't, et cetera, et cetera. You don't have the same risk that somebody who's a senior has, who's worried about maintaining their pension and all those kinds of things. But yeah, to me, it's kind of surprising to see seniors attaching themselves in this election to the Liberals as much as they did. What I've seen throughout most of my time in politics is that the Liberals tend to do a little better with women, and the Conservatives a little better with men. Right.
Sure.
But the seniors youth thing, I think maybe can go either way. I don't know.
Very interesting. And we got 2 minutes, so we'll ask one more question here. If you're Pierre Poilievre, what do? You just lost your seat in Carleton. You gained your seat, gained a number of seats. It looks like your leadership is safe. Even some of the critics that we saw out of Ontario are saying that you should stay on. Speaking of Corey tonight specifically. So I don't think we're going to have an internal caucus revolt against him. But running in a by-election, do you try to go as quickly as possible? Do you leave some time to allow your deputies to kind of get there? And if you're Mark Carney, do you grant an instant by-election, or do you make him wait the full 6 months? And where do you run? I've heard speculation Alberta. I've heard speculation in Eastern Ontario and some of the more rural ridings. What would you do, and what should we expect?
I would not run away from Ontario. I think I really do believe, I heard about Alberta, but I really do believe he should stay in Ontario. Otherwise, it looks like he's running away when we just had a really good result in Ontario. So do it quickly, and hope that the Liberals are nice, that's a hope. That hope is not a strategy. I get that. So it might be a few months before that happens, but he's got to get the process going. You mentioned caucus. Now, yes, I think the pressure on Pierre to resign and cause a leadership is low at this point, but there's going to be a reckoning, believe me, and Jeff knows what caucus is like. There will be a reckoning in caucus for this. Mm-hmm. It's not going to be all sweetness and light and rainbows.
Bye, Jenny.
And unicorns.
Goodbye, Jenny.
So I don't know what that means exactly, but I think it would be really silly or stupid of him to just say everything worked fine. As I said at the outset of this, we lost the election. Okay, like you can't gild the lily on this. We lost the election. Some things have to change for us to win the election. So, and as I said, hope is not a strategy. So, I think that some things have to change.
What do you think on that, Jeff? And also you're doing a little bit of the Ottawa sin of inside baseball. Who's Jenny? I think a lot of our members aren't probably familiar with her.
Okay, so yeah, Jenny Byrne was the Conservative campaign manager, right, the head of the campaign, and she was basically the subject of part of Corey Tenike's attack and so forth during the campaign, arguing that they were taking the wrong approach and all this kind of stuff, right? So, you know, but what happens normally, if you want to give the leader a hard time and you kind of want to attack him, but you don't want to kill the leader, you talk about how bad their staff are and how they have to be changed, right? And so there may be some sacrifices that are made there, but I predict that when the House sits, and I just looked at the calendar, the 15th of September is a Monday, and it's usually around that time of September that the House will sit. So 15th of September, the House will come back from its summer break, right? I predict that by then, Pierre Poilievre will have a seat in the House.
There you go. You heard it
There you
here
go.
first.
There you go.
Take it to the bank. You know, that and that we're all going to die, according to Tony.
But
So,
having said that, my predictions are usually much better when they're about the past.
Touche.
anyway, we'll wrap it up there. But thank you so much, both of you, for two tremendous discussions that we had, both before the election and now after it. So I'm sure our members found it very interesting. So we very much appreciate that. Thank you for everyone tuning in today. Any questions, feel free to reach out to the Fertilizer Canada GR team. And please let us know if you have any questions. So,
Matt,
Jeff,
the surprise guest had an urgent meeting. Something urgent came up, just so you know. I got a text to that effect. So we won't go any further than that.
Yeah. Okay. You guys will have to wait for the next surprise guest that we have. So I'm sure we'll bring them back. So stay tuned for that. But thank you, everyone. And we'll all talk later. So have a good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.